All right, I'm going to be talking about the function of the European Union and more specifically kind of how it's structured and things of that nature. Just to start off with, that's the flag of the European Union. It's more or less situated on here. There's a lot of ins and outs, a lot of what have yous. But essentially, it's 28 states, many overseas territories, and various agreements with neighboring countries. And of course, I mean, many treaties with countries all around the world. And that's just a image of what the area looks like, more or less, in terms of uh, territories around the world. I wanted to talk about how the government works. So here you got like the national parliaments who have sort of ceded powers over. Then you have the national governments that are working in to promote certain aspects of the European Union. And then you have the European Parliament that elects a president, but there's also a council of ministers. There's a European Commission that also appoints a president that works with the council that is the leaders of the European Union, and then they have a president, and then there's heads of the states of government. So you got an executive working over there, but I mean, there's kind of a layer. It's not exactly federalism, and I don't think it would be a good idea to ever call it federalism because politically that's not a good word. But in some sense, there it is an unidentified sort of function of government, which makes it very interesting. And you have the European Central Bank and the European Court of Justice. So I mean, those are essentially the institutions of government. I also put another slide here, but it's not working too well. The European Union was started off by the Treaty of Paris, and it's really good. Here's the definition. Basically, it started off as the Coal and Steel Treaty, and it's uniting the coal industry and the steel industry after World War II, about 6 years, I guess. Yeah. And it's interesting because they're trying to. A lot of people say that the military-industrial complex started the war. Well, if that's true, then they just unified the military-industrial complex in terms of all these countries and just sort of unified Europe together. So that's incredibly nice. And it sort of would lead to indicate that it wouldn't be good for business to go to war because they're going to be merged together, and it's a great idea to avoid war, and really that's putting economics, theory, history, everything put together, and that was sort of the start of the European Union, and then so basically, but continuing on, the European Union started off with the Treaty of the European Union. And on Article 13 is where I want to focus on the European Union that created these various branches of government. It created how the European Union is supposed to function, and it sort of continued on from the Treaty of Paris. But first, let's go to the European Council. The European Council is the sort of executive branch. It's not directly analogous to parliamentary systems or systems in the U.S., but basically it provides the impetus and direction for the European Union. It's the summit of the heads of states and of government, and they elect the president of the European Union and the president of the European Commission. It gives the necessary impetus for the development of the Union, sets its general objectives and priorities, will not legislate, and it's based in Brussels. So that's kind of the European Council. And this is kind of how they legislate at the Council of the European Union. Basically, the Council of the European Union is the legislature. It shares with Parliament the budgetary power, ensures coordination of the broad economic and social policy. It sets out guidelines for the common foreign and security policies, which is CFSP, concludes international agreements, and is based in Brussels. So that's the European Council. But we also have another aspect of legislature, and it's the European Parliament. And there's a symbol right there because it's generally what the Parliament looks like. It's the legislative seat that acts together with the council as a legislature. So in a sense, you kind of have two bodies, although it's not clearly defined as a Senate and House of Representatives in the United States. But basically, they share with the council the budgetary power and decides the last instance on the budget. It exerts democratic control over the institutions, including the European Commission, and approves the Commission members. Based on its plenary power, it sits in Strasbourg, which is in France, interesting, right? And in Brussels. And that apparently evidently used to be a problem because Brussels, is in Belgium and Strasbourg is in France, and perhaps coming from the United States, not the longest distance in the world, but still they had a lot of issues in terms of transporting, all these papers, all the papers between here and there. But now in the digital age, it's very, simple, and as far as I understand, they've sort of overcome those problems. But continuing on, we also have the European Commission, which is more or less the executive branch. It submits proposals for new legislation to the Parliament and the Council. It implements the policies, administers the budget, ensures compliance with the European law, and it's sort of the guardian of the treaties, so to speak, and it negotiates international agreements, and it's based in Brussels. So it leads to indicate that Brussels is more or less the capital of the European Union. But continuing on, we also have the European Court of Justice, which ensures the uniform application of the European law. So it's kind of a good judiciary, definitely. I think this fits kind of squarely into the judiciary. However, it has many more members than the United States Supreme Court, which is very interesting. It has the power to decide legal disputes between member states and institutions, businesses, and individuals. But it's based in Luxembourg, so that's also interesting in itself. So, Brussels is more or less the capital, but, various branches can be set out. And that's probably a good idea because, if one place is better than another place, you might as well do it there if it's easier to get around. Now, although you wouldn't say that the Federal Reserve in the United States is necessarily outlined in the Constitution of 1787, it is part of the government, and, it's kind of but anyway, the European Central Bank would be analogous to the Federal Reserve in the United States. Although, it's not a perfect analogy, but anyway, that's the symbol of the European Central Bank, and it forms together with the national central banks the European system of central banks, and thereby determines the monetary policy for the Eurozone. So big stuff. You might have heard this all the time with the Greek crisis. Big player, big stuff. It also ensures the price stability in the Eurozone by controlling the money and money supply. Interestingly enough, it's based in Frankfurt. Finally, of the institutions outlined in Article 13 of the Treaty of the European Union, you have the European Court of Auditors. And these are more or less kind of accountants. It checks the proper implementation of the budget and things of that nature, and it's based in Luxembourg. So basically, going back to a former slide, we have the 28 states, many overseas territories, and this complicated system seems to have gotten a little bit more clear. It was set out by the Treaty of the European Union. As I had mentioned, it had origins in the Treaty of Paris from 1951. That was to establish the unification of the coal and steel industry, which would, in a sense, make sure that Europe wouldn't go into war. For war you use steel to build tanks, so to speak, and things of that nature, and coal to run the tanks, essentially. So, and as we pointed out, Article 13 of the Treaty of the European Union sets out this structure of government. The Union's institutions are the European Parliament, the European Council, the European Commission, the European Court of Justice of the Court of Justice in the European Union, and the European Central Bank, and the European Court of Auditors. So that is sort of how it works from a bird's eye view of how these things go. And it's very simple. I got all these images from Wikipedia. None of these are essentially original thoughts. They're all, I got this quote from Wikipedia. All these images are from Wikipedia. I know nothing. This isn't legal advice. It's not to be relied upon at all. I'm just setting this up for educational purposes for myself to understand how the European Union works. It is not a complete idea at all, or a complete list of how it works, but it is just an introductory situation.